Welcome to Dead Scary Stories. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share and subscribe. Also comment where and what time you're watching from. Now lie back, relax and let sleep consume you. I only wanted to be near him again to remind him of what we had. He was always so quick to move on, to wipe the slate clean like it didn't matter. It mattered to me. It still does. I wasn't ready to let go, not fully. Not when everything else in my life felt like it was unraveling. I found out about the flat through a friend, though she didn't know she was telling me. A harmless comment about him starting fresh in a new place, some casual detail about where it was. I should have left it at that, but one quiet evening, alone in my flat, I typed the address into a map and stared at the screen for what felt like hours. Something about knowing exactly where he was. It felt impossible to ignore. The first night I went there, it wasn't to go inside. I just wanted to see the building, to confirm that it was real. It was a quiet block tucked into a corner of a sleepy neighborhood, the kind of place he'd always said he wanted. The lights from the windows seemed warm, inviting, and I stood in the dark street wondering which one was his. I didn't have a plan. I didn't think I'd need one. It wasn't hard to figure out which flat was his. I noticed little things that gave him away. The faint glow of his computer through the curtains, the bike he always rode chained up outside. It felt like stepping back into a life I thought I'd lost. Before I knew it, I was coming back almost every night just to see, just to feel like I was part of his world again, even if he didn't know it. The attic was a last-minute decision. I'd noticed the ladder outside the building during one of my visits. Maintenance, I assumed. I don't know what made me do it, but I waited until the street was empty and climbed up. The hatch wasn't locked, it was barely even latched. The space inside was cramped and stifling, but it was quiet, and I realized I could hear everything. His movements, his footsteps, even the faint sound of him breathing as he slept. It was like being close to him again in a way I hadn't been for so long. I started leaving things there, just little things. A bottle of water, a blanket. I didn't think he'd ever notice, not up here. I spent hours lying on the dusty floorboards, listening to the creaks of the flat below. There were moments when I thought I'd pushed it too far, when he paused in his routine, as if he'd sensed something out of place. But he never looked up. He never thought to check. The vent was my mistake. I wasn't thinking, I was curious, and I let myself get too close. I didn't expect him to glance up at the exact moment I was looking through. His eyes met mine for a split second and I froze, pulling back so quickly I scraped my hands on the metal edges. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay on the floor of the attic listening to him move around below. The sound of his voice, raised and panicked, made my stomach twist. I pressed myself against the boards, praying he wouldn't think to come up here. When the police arrived, I knew it was over. I heard their voices, the way they stomped through the flat and eventually made their way to the attic hatch. I backed into a corner, gripping the blanket I'd brought with me as the hatch opened and the torchlight swept across the space. There was no point in hiding. They found the ladder outside, the footprints leading up to the hatch. They found the things I'd left behind, the evidence of how long I'd been there. I thought he'd understand in some small way. I thought he'd know that I only did it because I couldn't let go, because I didn't know how to live without him. But when they brought me down, his face was pale, his eyes wide with something I didn't recognize. He didn't say anything, he just stood there, staring as they led me away. I turned back once, hoping to see something in his expression that told me he remembered what we had, but his face stayed blank and the door closed behind me. I followed him, not at first. When he left, when the papers were signed and it was all neat and official, I thought I could let it go. I thought I could pack up his absence the way he had packed up his things, efficiently, quickly, with no hesitation. But then came the silence, filling every room in the house where his voice used to be. I would lie in bed at night, staring at the darkened ceiling, feeling a kind of vibration in my chest, like something inside me knew I wasn't done. I didn't mean to track him down, not at the beginning. It wasn't like I had a plan. I just wanted to know where he'd gone. He had disappeared so completely, leaving me with nothing but the name of the city he was moving to. It was easy in the end, too easy. A few searches online, and there he was. New apartment, new start. A quiet little place tucked away on an unremarkable street. I stared at the screen for a long time, my hands resting on the keyboard, unsure of what came next. The first night I stood outside his building, I told myself it was curiosity. I didn't bring anything with me, no phone, no wallet, nothing that could tether me to the outside world. I just wanted to see the place. That's what I told myself as I walked up to the entrance, glancing over my shoulder to make sure no one was around. The buzz of the city faded as I stood there staring at the rows of letterboxes. His name was on one of them, neat and typed. It was strange seeing it like that. Just a name, not the person I used to know. I didn't go inside that night. I just stood there for a long time, then walked back to my car, but I came back the next night and the night after that. Each time I got a little closer. I walked the hallways, memorized the sound of the floorboards beneath my feet. The building had a kind of stillness to it, like it was holding its breath. I wondered if he felt it too. The first time I got into his flat, it was easier than I expected. The locks were simple, like he wasn't expecting anyone to try. I didn't take anything. I didn't touch much, just stood in the center of the room, breathing in the faint scent of him that still lingered in the air. His books were on the shelf, his shoes neatly lined up by the door. It was all so ordinary. I couldn't quite believe he'd built this life without me, like I'd never been part of it at all. I don't know why I started moving things, just little things here and there. A book out of place, a cup left on the counter. I wanted to see if he'd notice, if he'd feel it, the way I felt the echo of him in every corner of my own house. He didn't seem to, though. He went about his life as if nothing was wrong. The cat was a problem. It watched me sometimes, its green eyes unblinking, as I moved through the flat. I didn't touch it. I never would, but it knew. It always knew. The night he saw me was different. I hadn't planned to stay. I just wanted to be close, to feel the air of his flat around me. The closet seemed safe. It was deep enough to hide in, and I could watch him through the slats, see the rise and fall of his chest as he slept. I'd never seen him sleep before. He always went to bed after me, always got up before me. I used to joke that he didn't need sleep, that he was powered by sheer stubbornness. That night, though, something shifted. The door creaked open before I was ready, and the cat moved to the bed, staring straight at me. I froze, watching as he stirred, the light from the bedside lamp washing over the room. I could see him fully now, his face confused and groggy as he looked at the closet. I waited for him to go back to sleep, but he didn't. He stood up, walked towards me, his steps hesitant. When he opened the door, I smiled. I don't know why. It wasn't planned, wasn't intentional. It just happened, like the muscles in my face moved on their own. I could see the way he froze, the way his breath caught in his throat. He didn't scream, he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me like I wasn't real. I stayed that way until he turned away, until he ran from that room. I didn't follow. I just closed the door and waited, listening to the sounds of the flat settling around me. It felt like home, in a way I hadn't expected. It was never supposed to get this far. At least that's what I told myself every time I crossed another line. There was a time when I could have let go, when I could have moved on like everyone said I should. But there was something about him, about that I couldn't abandon no matter how much he wanted me to. And when he left, when he blocked me from his life and thought changing his locks would keep me out, he underestimated just how much I knew about him, about what he wanted, about what we were. I'd been there last night. That part I'm not ashamed of. I'd let myself in, moved through his flat as quietly as I could manage. It wasn't difficult. He always forgets the basics, the small ways people can leave traces of themselves behind. The bathroom window doesn't shut all the way. He never noticed it. I did. I noticed everything, and when I climbed inside, the feeling that came over me was so familiar, so as though I'd always belonged there. I'd left a few drops of my perfume on his pillow, just a faint trace, enough that he'd catch it when he woke up. He'd know I'd been there. He wouldn't be able to ignore it, no matter how hard he tried. It wasn't just about being noticed. It was about reminding him that he couldn't truly shut me out, not entirely. I watched him from the corner of the room for a long time. He looked so peaceful, so unaware. His chest rising and falling, his hands twitching faintly in his sleep. I couldn't resist. I reached for my phone and snapped a photo. It felt intimate, almost tender, like capturing a memory of the way things used to be, the way things be. When I left, I didn't go far, just down the street where I could sit and watch his building from the shadows. My phone buzzed in my hand and I opened the photo again, staring at his face. There was something almost sacred about it. I decided to send it to him. I wanted to see how he'd react, how it would make him feel when he woke up and saw himself, frozen in time like that, vulnerable, bare. I waited until the lights in his flat flickered on, until I could imagine him rubbing his eyes, stretching, going about his morning routine. I imagined him catching the scent of me on his pillow, pausing, frowning, and then I imagined the moment he saw the photo, the flicker of confusion, the ripple of fear. That's when I allowed myself a smile. Hours passed. The day dragged on and I stayed close. I had a small flat of my own, but it felt like a prison compared to the freedom I felt being near him, knowing I could slip in and out of his world whenever I wanted. I imagined him pacing, checking his locks, convincing himself it was all some kind of mistake. He'd probably call someone about it, the police, maybe. I doubted they'd take him seriously. That was the beauty of it. As long as I stayed careful, no one would believe him. When night fell, I made my way back to his building. He'd never bothered to install cameras or security systems. He was too trusting, too naive. It was one of the things I loved about him. The bathroom window was still open, and I slipped inside without a sound. This time I didn't stop in the corner of the room. I crept closer, my heart pounding in my chest. There was something electric about the way the darkness wrapped around us, the way he stirred faintly in his sleep, oblivious to my presence. I reached out, just barely brushing my fingers against the edge of his blanket. For a moment I hesitated. I wondered if I should wake him, if I should force him to see me, to confront what he'd tried so hard to leave behind. But then I heard a sound outside, a car engine, faint and distant, and it jolted me back to reality. I slipped back out the way I'd come, leaving the flat exactly as I'd found it. I didn't go far, just a few streets away where I could keep an eye on the building. I'd made my mark, left my message. He'd wake up knowing I'd been there again, and that was enough, for now. I'd been living in the flat for weeks before he showed up. It wasn't much. One of those compact places with peeling paint and windows that barely opened. The bathroom was the worst, cramped and damp no matter how often I wiped down the tiles. But it suited my needs. Quiet, unassuming, and easy to slip in and out of without drawing attention. It wasn't difficult to find out where he was living after he moved. He thought he could leave me, just disappear into a new life like I wouldn't notice. As if I didn't know the way his mind worked. He was predictable, always had been. Once I tracked him to this neighborhood, I scouted out the area, learning his patterns. I spent days blending into the background, invisible to him, but always close. I knew his work schedule, morning commute, lunch break, the way he always seemed to grab a takeaway coffee on his way home. By the time he was settling into this new chapter of his life, I was already there, watching from the periphery. The flat I found was directly below his. From the moment I moved in, I could hear him walking above me, the muffled sound of his TV, the scrape of furniture being rearranged. It was comforting in a way, knowing I was always nearby. He probably thought he was safe up there, locked away from everything he thought he'd left behind. The shower curtain was the first thing I noticed when I went upstairs. It was a hideous floral print, faded and drooping, but it worked to my advantage. I spent hours waiting behind it, holding my breath whenever he stepped near. He never thought to check. That made me laugh sometimes, how clueless he was. I made small adjustments to his routine, little things to test how far I could go without being noticed. The door to his flat was always easy to slip past. He was careless with his locks. At first I'd move objects ever so slightly. A coffee mug left on the counter would be shifted to the sink, a picture frame turned just a fraction. I wanted to see if he would notice, if he would feel the shift in his space. He didn't. I found the knife in his kitchen drawer. I liked the feel of it, the way the blade caught the light as I held it. I thought about leaving it in strange places to see how he'd react, but that felt too bold too soon. Instead, I carried it with me whenever I slipped into his flat. The bathroom became my favorite spot. It was the only room without windows, always dim and silent. The smell of mildew clung to the walls, and the fan hummed faintly when he turned it on. It was the perfect place to wait. I would tuck myself behind the curtain, the plastic pressing against me, and listen to the sounds of his life just beyond the door. There was something intoxicating about being so close to him without his knowledge. I'd stand there for hours, gripping the knife, picturing the moment when he would finally see me. It was a game, and I was in control. The night it happened, I knew he was coming home late. His job had been keeping him longer than usual, and I used the extra time to make my preparations. The knife was ready, gleaming on the bathroom sink as I waited. I could hear his footsteps on the stairs, the sound of his keys jangling as he unlocked the door. I stood behind the curtain, knife in hand, as he moved through the flat. His routine was always the same: drop his bag, check his phone, head to the bathroom. He opened the door, flicked on the light, and stepped inside. I could feel his presence through the thin barrier of plastic between us. He moved closer, reaching for the shower curtain. I held my breath, the knife steady in my grip. The curtain was yanked back, and there he was. His face twisted in shock as our eyes met. I smiled at him, wide and unblinking, holding the knife where he could see it. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then everything happened at once. It was never meant to get like this. I didn't plan for things to spiral the way they have, but here we are, and here I am, somewhere I don't belong, but can't seem to leave. I'd known about the cabin for years. He'd told me about it during better days when we'd talk about our childhoods and future plans, as though the two were the same thing. It was his family's place, tucked away in the kind of remote countryside where phone signals get swallowed by the hills and roads, disappear into woods that grow taller than you think they should. He'd taken me there once, a few years ago, when things were simpler, and I'd loved the way it felt like stepping out of the world. Back then, it had been a haven. Now, it was something else entirely. After he left, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. Days dragged into weeks, and no matter how hard I tried to move on, it felt like I was floating just outside of everything. I couldn't get him out of my head. I'd sit in my flat, staring at my phone, wondering if he was thinking about me the way I was thinking about him. Then I found out he'd gone to the cabin, and something shifted. It wasn't a decision, exactly. It was more like an instinct. If he was there, then maybe that was where I needed to be, too. It was late when I arrived, and the road leading to the cabin was barely more than a trail. I parked a short walk away, not wanting to risk the sound of the engine carrying through the stillness. The place looked exactly as I remembered, a squat, weathered building crouching at the edge of the woods, its windows reflecting nothing but the blackness of the trees. The thought of him inside, sleeping, was enough to bring me to the door before I'd even considered what I was doing. I didn't knock. That would have been too much, too sudden. Instead, I circled around to the back and found the door there ajar, as though the cabin itself had been expecting me. The quiet creak as I pushed it open made my breath catch, but nothing stirred. Inside, the air was cold and faintly damp, carrying the smell of wood and something metallic. I moved through the kitchen, past the narrow table and the sink filled with dishes, my footsteps so light they hardly seemed to exist. When I reached the small living room, I saw him. He was asleep on the sofa, a blanket draped over him and one arm thrown across his chest. His face was soft in the dim light of a single lamp, and for a moment I just stood there, looking at him. I hadn't seen him in months, but he hadn't changed. Not really. His hair was a little longer, his cheeks a little thinner, but it was still him. I felt a pull deep inside, something warm and aching, and before I knew what I was doing, I was beside him. I don't know how long I stayed there. It could have been minutes or hours. The room was silent except for the sound of his breathing, slow and even, and I found myself leaning closer, close enough to catch the scent of his skin. Without thinking, I reached out and let my fingers brush against his hair. It was softer than I remembered, and the warmth of him seemed to radiate into me, filling the hollow spaces inside. I didn't want to leave, but I couldn't stay, not yet. I slipped out the way I came, the door clicking shut behind me like an afterthought. The next day I kept my distance. I watched from the woods as he went about his day, chopping firewood and checking the windows as though he sensed something. He didn't leave the cabin, not even to walk down to the stream at the edge of the property. I waited until nightfall before I went back. This time the door was locked, but the window by the kitchen wasn't, and it took only a moment to slide it open and climb through. He was in the bedroom this time, curled on his side with the blanket pulled up to his chin. I stood in the doorway, my breath hitching as I looked at him. There was something so vulnerable about the way he slept, as though the walls he'd built during the day fell away with the dark. I approached slowly, careful not to disturb him, and sat on the edge of the bed. The urge to touch him, to be close to him, was overwhelming, and before I knew it, I was leaning over him, my hand moving to his hair again. I started humming low and soft, a tune I didn't recognize but that seemed to rise from somewhere deep inside me. It felt right, the sound filling the room and wrapping around us like a thread. His face twitched, and for a moment I thought he might wake, but he didn't. I stayed there until the first hint of dawn crept through the window, and then I left, slipping back into the woods as quietly as I'd come. The next day I saw him set up a camera near the back door. I knew he must have seen the signs I'd left behind, the faint impressions on the carpet, the blanket slightly out of place, but he didn't seem frightened. Not yet. That night I didn't go inside. I stayed by the window, watching as he sat in the living room, staring at the door with a tension in his shoulders I hadn't seen before. He looked tired, the kind of tired that sinks into your bones, and I wondered if he could feel me out here. Just beyond the glass, I haven't decided what to do next. The woods are cold at night, but the cabin is warm and he's inside, just out of reach. I think he's starting to understand now, the way we're tied together, the way we always will be. I'll give him time, he'll come around. The house was smaller than I'd expected. When I first saw it, tucked into the corner of a quiet street, I felt a kind of satisfaction I hadn't felt in months. It was plain, unremarkable. It suited him, really. He always liked things to be functional, nothing more. The house was that, functional, the kind of place where someone goes to disappear, and that's exactly what he thought he'd done. The night he left, I watched him pack up. I'd been standing at the window of our bedroom, pressed into the corner so he wouldn't see me. He moved with precision, folding his clothes, stacking his books. It wasn't impulsive. He'd been planning it for weeks. He'd pretended not to hear when I begged him to stay. His silence was worse than if he'd shouted back. When the door finally closed behind him, it was as if something had snapped inside me. At first I didn't know where he'd gone. He hadn't told anyone, not his family, not his few friends. He always had this habit of retreating, as though pulling away could solve his problems. I spent weeks searching. I started with his usual haunts, the office, the coffee shop where he pretended to work on weekends, even the awful little pub he hated. He wasn't at any of them. It was almost impressive, really, how thoroughly he'd vanished. I found him by chance, through the sort of luck that makes you believe in something greater than yourself. I'd been driving through the city when I saw his car parked outside a newsagent's, the same faded blue saloon he'd had since university, the one he never could let go of. My hands shook as I sat there in my own car watching the street, waiting to see him. When he finally emerged, carrying a bag of groceries, it was as though something inside me came alive again. I knew then that I couldn't let him slip away. The house was easy to get into. But people always think they're safe in places like this, surrounded by quiet streets and hedges. His back door was old, the latch loose. I stood in his kitchen that first night, breathing in the unfamiliar air, taking in the way he'd started over without me. There was a photo on the fridge of him and someone else, a woman. It didn't matter that she wasn't in focus. The fact she existed was enough. I found the crawl space that night. The opening was in the hallway ceiling, a small square panel that pushed up with barely a sound. The space itself was cramped, the floor covered in fiberglass insulation. It wasn't comfortable, but it was better than leaving. I pulled the panel shut behind me and stayed there, lying flat in the dark. I could hear him moving below me, his footsteps crossing from the kitchen to the living room. He'd always had that way of pacing when he thought no one was watching. I stayed hidden during the day, slipping out at night when I knew he was asleep. The house became mine in those hours. I walked through the rooms, touching the objects he'd so carefully arranged. I read his papers, shuffled through the drawer where he kept his keys. Sometimes I stood at the edge of his bed, watching his chest rise and fall. His face looked softer in sleep, almost like it used to. After a week, I started to leave things. Small reminders, just enough to make him notice. I moved the book he'd been reading from the table to the counter. I left the bathroom light on after he'd gone to bed. Once, I took a single sock from his drawer and dropped it into the washing machine. He noticed, I know he did. He began checking the locks at night, walking through the house with his phone in hand as though he were searching for something he couldn't name. I stayed in the crawl space those nights, listening. When he installed the cameras, I was almost proud of him. He was always so practical, always looking for solutions. It wasn't hard to avoid them, though. I knew where each one was positioned, how to move through the house without stepping into their view. Still, I felt the tension in him growing. He slept less, tossing and turning in his bed, his breathing quick and shallow. I lay above him, the wood beams pressing into my back, and counted the seconds between his movements. The night he saw me, I'd grown careless. I'd been standing at the edge of the bed again, watching the way his face tightened in his sleep. I thought he wouldn't wake. He hadn't before. But this time, his eyes opened. For a moment, neither of us moved. He stared at me, his expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and terror. Then I turned and left the room. I climbed into the crawl space, pulling the panel shut behind me, and waited. It's been quiet since then. He hasn't moved from the house, not yet. I don't think he knows what to do. I hear him below, pacing again, his steps heavier than before. Sometimes he stands in the hallway, right beneath where I am, and I wonder if he's looking up, if he can feel me there. I don't know what he'll do next. I only know that I'm not leaving. I never planned to intrude upon his new life, yet I found it impossible to let go. After our separation, I carried on with my days, though a part of me remained tethered to the memories we shared. When I discovered that his bedroom window would unlock with a little push, I felt a stir of recognition, a sign that I could still reach him. I began to visit his flat at night. I would walk past the quiet streets until I arrived outside his building. The corridors reminded me of the long evenings we once spent together, though now they carried an unfamiliar chill. I found a way to enter his apartment without forcing anything. I did not want to be seen. I only wished to be present in a manner that would leave no direct trace. The window had become my focus. Each night I found a chance to nudge it open by a fraction so that the lock would disengage on its own. I knew his new lock was sturdy, that he believed the problem was over once he replaced it. He must have assumed the malfunction was merely a fault in the mechanism. I realized he had no idea that I was responsible for it. I spent many evenings by the building, hidden in the dark recesses of the street, working on a plan to make him remember me. I did not enter the flat, nor did I leave any obvious marks, but I made sure that each night the window would be found in a state that made no sense. Sometimes I turned the latch, sometimes I eased the window open a bit more, allowing the cool air to disturb the curtains. I did not act with any purpose beyond the need to feel connected, even if it was only through a disruption in his routine. One particular night I crept closer than before. The wind was brisk, and the movement of the curtains was unmistakable as it moved in the gusts that found their way through the open window. I could not see him at the time, but I knew he would awaken to an unexpected sight. I left behind something that I hoped would signal my presence in a way he could not dismiss, a single strand of hair. I pressed it into the window frame so that it would be caught as the wind carried it to rest. In the morning, I imagined him rising from sleep, noticing the breach in his secure haven. His expression must have been one of bafflement as he examined the open window and the fluttering curtains, as if in denial that the door had been tampered with. I recalled the moments when he used to check every detail around his home, the careful way he arranged his life. I was sure that discovering a piece of me in his new existence would trouble him deeply. I returned night after night, methodically ensuring that the window would unlock itself. I found myself leaving small tokens of my presence, sometimes a stray hair, sometimes a gentle adjustment that defied explanation. I took care to avoid detection, keeping my actions hidden from prying eyes and cameras. I hoped that one day he would connect these disruptions to a person he once knew well. I noticed that the disruptions did not cease, even after he replaced the lock. Each morning brought with it the same inexplicable discovery. The window wide open, the curtains billowing in the breeze, and often a strand of hair that I knew belonged to me. I had never imagined that he might find these signs so disturbing, but it seemed that his sleep was interrupted by the shock of the open window and the inexplicable details left behind. On a night that felt colder than the others, I approached his window with the care of someone retracing old steps in a place full of memories. I ran my fingers through my hair, plucking a single strand, and placed it so that it would nestle within the frame. The wind danced around me as I departed, leaving behind the quiet evidence of my presence. I could not help but feel a quiet satisfaction at the thought of him encountering the unmistakable sign of what once was. I now wander through the dim streets on many nights, my mind occupied with the quiet act of connection, even if it is one-sided. Each time I return to his building, I leave behind the evidence of my presence, a piece of my past intricately woven into his daily life. I do not wish to be seen, nor do I desire any confrontation. I only want him to notice, however subtly, that the past has not been fully erased. I leave the building after each visit with no fanfare, merging with the dark streets as if I were never there at all. With every new night, I continue my silent campaign, a series of small, unexplained disruptions that blur the line between memory and reality. There is no promise of resolution, no end to this quiet intrusion. The disturbances persist, each morning a mystery that remains unsolved, each piece of hair and each open window a reminder that something has been left behind.